If you've not been here or you're visiting for the first time, we are, as a church, we're working through the Gospel of John, and today we have landed in John chapter 7, and Dan's going to read today's passage for us in a moment. I don't know how many of us have got siblings. I'm one of 4. Growing up, all 4 of us, but my 2 brothers especially, probably, were really good at kind of goading each other into doing things. So there was always either a practical joke going on. I remember one of my brothers offering me a sweet once, which I was really quite touched to accept from my younger brother until I put it in my mouth. And then he was more excited than I was because it was disgusting. But we were great at daring each other to just say the most outlandish things in public, or do ridiculous things, or wear ridiculous outfits. I don't know how my mum coped with it all, and as much as I like to think we've all grown out of it, I'm not entirely sure when the family gets together. And maybe that's your experience, maybe it isn't, or maybe you have friends who you have that kind of relationship with. There's something about that relationship where you can kind of get away with saying stuff and taunting and goading a little bit more than you would with other people. And in today's passage, we're going to have a look at Jesus' relationship with his brothers, with his siblings, and we'll see a little bit of that coming through there. But Dan, if I could get you to read. If you're following along, we're doing John chapter 7, verses 1 to 30. Today, I'm afraid I haven't been organised enough to put it on a slide for you. So if you've got a Bible with you, then do read along, and if not, listen carefully.
So I'm reading from the New Living Translation. After this, Jesus travelled around Galilee. He wanted to stay out of Judea, where the Jewish leaders were plotting his death. But soon it was time for the Jewish festival of shelters, and Jesus' brothers said to him, "Leave here and go to Judea, where your followers can see your miracles. You can't become famous if you hide like this. If you can do such wonderful things, show yourselves to the world." For even his brothers didn't believe in him. Jesus replied, "Now is not the right time for me to go, but you can go any time. The world can't hate you, but it does hate me because I accuse it of doing evil. You go on, I'm not going to this festival because my time has not yet come." After saying these things, Jesus remained in Galilee. But after his brothers left for the festival, Jesus also went, though secretly, staying out of public view. The Jewish leaders tried to find him at the festival and kept asking if anyone had seen him. There was a lot of grumbling about him among the crowds. Some argued, "He's a good man," but others said, "He's nothing but a fraud who deceives the people." But no one had the courage to speak favourably about him in public, for they were afraid of getting in trouble with the Jewish leaders. Then, midway through the festival, Jesus went up to the temple and began to teach. The people were surprised when they heard him. "How does he know so much when he hasn't been trained?" they asked. So Jesus told them, "My message is not my own. It comes from God who sent me. Anyone who wants to do the will of God will know whether my teaching is from God or it's merely my own. Those who speak for themselves want glory only for themselves, but a person who seeks to honor the one who sent him speaks truth, not lies. Moses gave you the law, but none of you obeys it. In fact, you're trying to kill me." The crowd replied, "You're demon-possessed. Who's trying to kill you?" Jesus replied, "I did one miracle on the Sabbath, and you were amazed. But you work on the Sabbath too, when you obey Moses' law of circumcision. Actually, this tradition of circumcision began with the patriarchs long before the law of Moses. For if the correct time for circumcising your son falls on the Sabbath, you go ahead and do it, so as not to break the law of Moses. So why should you be angry with me for healing a man on the Sabbath? Look beneath the surface so you can judge correctly." Some of the people who lived in Jerusalem started to ask each other, "Isn't this the man they're trying to kill? But here he is speaking in public and they say nothing to him. Could our leaders possibly believe that he's the Messiah? But how could he be? For we know where this man comes from. When the Messiah comes, he'll simply appear. No one will know where he comes from." While Jesus was teaching in the temple, he called out, "Yes, you know me, and you know where I come from. But I'm not here on my own. The one who sent me is true, and you don't know him. But I know him because I come from him, and he sent me to you." Then the leaders tried to arrest him, but no one laid a hand on him because his time had not yet come.
Thank you. So there's two bits of context that are going to be really important for us to remember. The first is that lots of Jesus' disciples have just deserted him. They've just left him. And Ed spoke about that last week. And he kind of threw it open to his 12 and said, "Do you want to go as well?" His teaching had got so hard that people had deserted him. So that's the first thing we need to remember. The second thing is that last time he was in Jerusalem, he healed a man on the Sabbath and had got into such trouble with the religious leaders that he knew they were now plotting to kill him. And that was a couple of chapters ago for John, but John's reminded us of that at the start of this chapter, because those are the things he wants us to bear in mind. So Jesus is in Galilee, kind of laying low for a little bit, fully aware and mindful of the fact that some of his followers have decided to leave him, fully aware of the fact that the leaders in Jerusalem would quite like to kill him. And the time for the next Jewish festival rolls around. And his brothers have this great idea, because they are certainly aware that his followers are deserting him. And so, perhaps in a bid to try and get some of those followers back, they say to him, "Hey Jesus, you know what you should do. If you are who you say you are, and you can do all of these things that you've been doing, you need to come with us to the next festival." It was probably the most popular of the festivals. Jerusalem was going to be packed. They said, "Come with us, do your miracles, build your following, do your teaching. This is what you should do. This is how you can get all your followers back." And there's nothing in the text to suggest that they were so mean that they were trying to get him killed. But there is that kind of challenge and goading and cynicism. And in fact, John tells us his brothers didn't believe in him yet, so they didn't quite get it. We know that some of them do later on. But at that stage, they don't get it. And Jesus' response is really interesting. He says, I can't go. My time hasn't come. I'm not going to this festival. And that's really interesting for two reasons. The first reason is that because he does go to that festival. And some translations are a little bit different here. Some of them have Jesus saying, "It's not time for me to go yet," or "I'm not going yet." And some of the manuscripts have a little bit of ambiguity around it. But the point is that Jesus says, "I'm not going to this one. You guys go." So it's interesting in the fact that he then decides to go. But it's also really interesting because this isn't the first time John tells us that a family member asked Jesus to do something, and he says, "Oh, it's not my time. Why are you involving me? It's not my time." And we looked at the first example of that in chapter 2 when we looked at the situation with Mary. So Jesus was at the wedding in Cana with Mary, perhaps even with these same brothers, and with some of his disciples. And we know that the wine ran out, and Mary said to Jesus, "They've run out of wine," as a way of asking him to do something about it. And he said a similar thing. He said, "What's that got to do with me? My time hasn't come." But what we get to see with Mary is that despite that, he does this incredible miracle. So there's something about what Mary does that's different to what the brothers are doing. And I think John includes both of those accounts fairly close together because he wants us to compare them. So we're going to do a bit of that this morning. Now, the fact that Jesus works to a completely different time frame to anyone or anything else in history is a bit of a theme for John. And we've seen that already. We've seen him slipping away when they wanted to make him king. We've seen him at the end of this passage somehow resist arrest, which I would have loved to have seen. I think that would have been great to see that play out. We know in a few chapters along, Jesus' different understanding of timing and urgency is going to play out for Lazarus and Mary and Martha in a really, really dramatic way. So John is showing us that actually Jesus has a completely different thinking, different time frame, different agenda to everyone else in the world. And it's interesting that Jesus says to his disciples, "You can go to the festival, your time is here. The world doesn't hate you, but the world hates me." So John's showing us that for Jesus, there is a completely different way of thinking and living and acting and a different timing to that of the world. We know that he got in trouble for healing on the Sabbath. It's really interesting that what he got in trouble for wasn't necessarily the healing. It was because he healed on the Sabbath. He healed on the wrong day. As far as the religious leaders are concerned, his timing is all wrong. And Jesus has already explained why his timing is so out of whack with what everyone else thinks God should do or what everyone else would expect him to do. Because when the religious leaders challenged him after he healed the man on the Sabbath, he said, hey, I can't do anything except what the Father's doing. So for Jesus, he lived a life that was so intimately interwoven with the Father and what he saw the Father saying and doing that he had no option but to act when he saw the Father acting and not beforehand. So when his brothers say to him, hey, you should go, let's go to Jerusalem, do some more miracles, build that following back up again, for Jesus, this isn't even an option. And perhaps because the Father hasn't told him yet what they're going to do around that festival. So Jesus is showing this really big difference between his thinking and his agenda and his timing, kingdom thinking, kingdom agenda, kingdom timing, and what the world's agenda and what the world thinks an appropriate timescale should be. You know, the suggestions that the brothers made weren't necessarily bad. Go to Jerusalem, do some more miracles, build a following. Jesus does all of these things, eventually. But there was something about their motivation, their reasoning, and their timing that just wasn't of the kingdom. So they go up to Jerusalem, and a little bit later, Jesus follows them. And it's not so much, I don't think, that he's deceived them. He didn't lie to them. I don't think he suddenly changed his mind. Oh, actually, that was a really good point. I'll see if I can catch up with them. But what he did was reject what they were suggesting that he should do. They wanted him to go loud. They wanted him to go big. They wanted him to go publicly. They want him to be part of the whole week-long celebration where they would all travel up to Jerusalem together. And for Jesus, that wasn't on his agenda. And we've heard these kinds of requests before. All throughout the Gospels, there are people that challenge Jesus. Go on then, do a sign for us, do another miracle for us. And Jesus rebuffs them in the same way that he rebuffed the brothers. Doing a sign on someone else's timescale or to prove who he was doesn't appear to have ever been on Jesus' agenda. So he waits till the midpoint of the festival. He goes up secretly. He stays quite hidden. He waits till the midpoint, perhaps until Jerusalem is as packed as it's going to be. And then he starts teaching publicly in the temple. So whereas his disciples wanted him to go early or on time, he went late. And where they wanted him to be public, he went secretly. And where they wanted him to do miracles, actually he was content to teach and debate a little bit more with those religious leaders and then slip away again when the time was right. So John's showing us that both Jesus' brothers and the religious leaders don't have a kingdom perspective. They are so boxed in to what they think the right way of doing things is that they can't comprehend what Jesus is doing. For the brothers, they're so fixated with this worldly mindset of this is what we do, this is what's important, this is how we do it, and this is when we do it. And for the religious leaders, they were blinded by their assumptions of who God is and what he does, and when he would choose to do that. And perhaps Jesus' brothers and those religious leaders aren't that different from some of us today. I'm sure that I've had similar debates with God. But Jesus is inviting them to think differently and to see things differently. And I think that's what he's inviting us to this morning as well. So whereas Jesus' brothers and those religious leaders don't get very many things right, Mary, on the other hand, gets a similar response from Jesus, but a completely different outcome. So she draws his attention to the fact that they've run out of wine at the wedding. And he says, why are you telling me? This has nothing to do with me. It's not my time. But we know that he then went on to do this most amazing miracle where he turns the water into wine and actually, for the first time, reveals something, it says in John, of who he is and his glory to his mother and disciples. Perhaps a little bit ahead of the time that he was going to do that. So whereas Jesus, his brothers and the religious leaders get a telling off, she gets to see this miracle that she could not have predicted, she could not have expected. And I think I know what camp I would rather be in. So let's have a little think about what it was about Mary that positioned her and that situation to have this different outcome. Well, first of all, Mary presents a problem to Jesus, whereas the brothers present a solution. In fact, they present a solution to a problem that they perceive. So, Jesus, you need a following, you need to go and you need to prove who you are. Jesus is in Galilee lying low because the religious leaders want to kill him, but that's not a problem to him. We can see that's not a problem because he goes to Jerusalem, he debates with those people again, and then it says that they tried to arrest him, but they couldn't. So what the brothers perceive to be as a problem isn't necessarily a problem. They bring their solution to this problem, whereas Mary just brings the problem. Mary trusted Jesus. She got that same initial rebuff. She got that same response. What's it to do with me? My time has not come. She doesn't then go back to him and plead with him and insist that he does something. She trusts. She knows who he is. She knows the relationship she has with him. She knows that she's invited him into a situation, and therefore he will do something. John tells us the brothers don't believe in Jesus yet. They don't have that faith. And finally, Mary offers complete and utter obedience. So instead of suggesting that Jesus do what she says, which is what his brothers have done, she says to the servants, whatever he says to you to do, do it. So what might that mean for us? If we want to bring situations and problems to God, how can we be more like Mary? Well, I think it means that perhaps we don't come with an agenda, or we don't come fully fixed on a problem that we've perceived is a problem. Perhaps we don't come to him with the answers that we want him to see. Imagine if Mary had said to the servants, do whatever he tells you, and Jesus, you know where there's some extra wine. Tell them where the extra wine is. Or if she said, come on, Jesus, I know there must be money somewhere. We must be able to get this wine. There must be a way you can do it. Can you pay for them? Or you've got contacts. You must have someone that they can go to. Tell them who they need to go to. It may have been that Jesus, in his generosity, may have still honoured that request. He might have helped. But she would have closed the door to this incredible miracle that we get to see Jesus do. So maybe sometimes we need to come with less of a specific agenda that we are insisting God needs to do as an answer to our prayer, and more open that up to him and see what he wants to say. I don't think that means that we're not honest with God. I don't think that means that we don't tell him what we'd love to see. He invites us to bring our needs before him. We know that Abraham and Moses both changed his mind because they were determined to see something else happen. We know that Job gets praised by God because he's brutally honest with God and he's really angry with his lot in life. So it's not necessarily that we don't come with our problems and we don't come with what we think what we think we would like God to do, but we open up the agenda to him to see if he wants to do. I'm sure I'm not the only one who's thought, well, God, if you would just do this here, then imagine how many people would see that and no one would be able to deny that you're God. Why don't you do it like this? But having read these passages, I think that sounds a bit more like Jesus' brothers than it sounds like Mary. sometimes I think that we think we know what's best, when actually we're still way too shaped by the values and the priorities and the loves of the world than we are by kingdom thinking. Mary persevered. She persevered when it looked like Jesus wasn't interested. What does it do? What does it have to do with me, he said. But she knew that she'd invited him into a situation, and she knew who he was, and she knew what she meant to him, and so she trusted. She wasn't deterred, but she didn't try to convince him otherwise. Sometimes I wonder if we spend so much time in prayer trying to convince God to do something, when we should trust, of course, he wants to do something. We don't need to convince him about that. But maybe what we do need to do is then stop and listen to what he's saying that we should be partnering with him about. Because her faith was then evidenced by obedience, and the obedience that she commanded the servants to have. How many times do we come to God with a list of things that we want him to do? And sometimes really specific things. Do this for my children, or take this person out of my workplace, or take this away from me, or change this situation for a family member. But then not pause long enough to listen to what he's actually doing and what his agenda is. And not pause long enough to say, okay, Lord, here's the problem. I'm going to obey you. What shall I do? What do you want us to do? He needs us to listen, and he needs us to partner for breakthrough. It's interesting, I think, that later on in the passage, when Jesus is teaching, and the crowd are just amazed, and they're like, gosh, what is this? Where has this teaching come from? Like, we don't get it. We don't get how you can be saying it. And Jesus says anyone who makes the will of God their priority will get it, will understand that this has come from God. So there is something about that commitment, the commitment to the obedience that Mary had, but also that commitment to saying, right, this is my priority. We might not understand everything, but that's the key to understand what God is doing. That is the beginning. There's something about this a heart that's so consumed with him and his kingdom and his glory and who he is that moves God to action. So there's a lot that we can learn from this comparison of Mary and the brothers, and in thinking about how we can be more like Mary. But if Jesus is also our model of how we are to live and our model of how we are to relate to the Father, then what can we learn from what Jesus is doing in this passage? What does it suggest about how we can live? So in these passages, Jesus demonstrates a way of living with the Father that is entirely in line with the kingdom of heaven. And it's entirely in line with the wisdom of heaven. And it's entirely in line with the agenda of heaven. And because of that, it's at odds with the wisdom and the agenda and the timing of the world. It's a way of living that enables him to sense when Mary asks him, oh, this isn't my time, but there's something about this request, and there's something about this humility, and there's something about this understanding of who I am that I'm going to say yes to. I'm going to use this opportunity. There's something about the way that Jesus lived so closely with the Father that enabled him in one moment to go, no, I'm not coming to the festival. This isn't what the Father's doing. This isn't right. But then probably hours at the very most later going, okay, now I need to go. There's something about the way that Jesus listened to the Father that meant that he knew in one moment he had to stay hidden. And in the next moment, he was going to teach publicly and debate with the very people who'd already decided to kill him. That in one moment, he was going to walk into a crowded place and heal a man on the Sabbath, which he knew would be provocative. Or that he was going to take a packed lunch and feed 5,000 people, which he knew was going to get a reaction. But in the next moment, it was time to slip away. At the start of the passage, his laying low in Galilee, he's not in Jerusalem. That looks to us like wisdom. That looks to me like common sense. Going to Jerusalem 2 days later and having an argument with the people that want to kill you looks to me like crazy. So sometimes kingdom thinking does look wise, but sometimes kingdom thinking looks mad. It looks crazy. I think what this shows is that his life of intimacy with the Father wasn't a life of hard and fast rules. It was nuanced, it was slow, it was a different reaction in different situations that sometimes looked like they made sense and sometimes looked like they didn't make sense. And I think that's what we're invited into. More than a life of, well, I'm a Christian, so I don't do this, and I do this, and my Sundays look like this, and I speak like this, and I read this, and I go to these places, and I don't go to those places. But actually, the Father's inviting us into a life, but there's much more nuance than that. There's much more intimacy than that. And sometimes it will look like wisdom, but sometimes it will look to the world that we're a little bit crazy. So I think today there are two invitations to us. I think the first one is to come to God with our needs, but without our agenda. And to allow him to set that agenda. To allow ourselves to think that actually maybe we haven't diagnosed the problem correctly, and probably we've not diagnosed the solution correctly. And to let go of what it is we think we need God to do. To let him be God instead of us, because he's a lot better at it than us. We need him to be sovereign, but we need to allow him to be sovereign. And I think the other invitation is to be more like Jesus, to shake off that mindset of the world, to shake off the influence of its values and its priorities and its loves and its way of doing things and its time frames. And instead, to make the will of God our priority. To be willing to listen to him, to be willing to move slowly. To guard our steps and our thoughts and our speech so that as much as we can do, we do what we see the Father is doing. And I think if we do those things, then we make space for miracles like the one that Mary saw, that was just so surprising and so overwhelming and so delightful. Like, I just think there must have been so many times where, as the disciples walked with Jesus, and perhaps after Mary had seen this, where they said, you know what, Jesus, we knew you were going to do something, but come on, that's amazing. You're so much better than I thought you were. And I think if we respond to these invitations and we lay down our agendas, then we get to see that. And it might be that we have to tear down some religious preconceptions and we have to shake off the world a little bit. But then we get to see these amazing things.